This spinning program presents many useful tips and techniques to use while spinning cotton, silk, and linen. Most of these fibers are finer than many wools and offer special challenges to the hand spinner. Patsy will teach you many helpful techniques which are guaranteed to get you started successfully as she works with various forms of these three fibers.
Hi, I'm Patsy Zawistoski, and I'll be your spinning teacher. Before we start working with cotton fibers, I'd like to say a few words about spinning wheels. If you have a double drive wheel, you'll want to move the drive band to the smallest drive whirl. This will give you a greater speed of twist and a smaller speed of take-up. If you have a bobbin lead wheel, like a luette, sometimes the take-up can be a bit difficult for spinning fine yarns. There are 4 things that will help with that. First, use the smallest end of the bobbin for the drive. Second, try a half-full or padded bobbin. Pipe insulation works easily here. Cut it to fit and slip it on. Third, remove the brake band on the flyer completely. And fourth, use a good oil or lubricant product, not a Vaseline. Now, if you're using a single drive Scotch brake wheel, like the Ashford I'm using, you'll also want to increase the twist and reduce the take-up. The take-up should be reduced until you can pull the yarn out while the wheel is spinning. There are 2 ways to do this. One is by using the take-up knob here, and the other is by reversing your bobbin so that the small end of the bobbin is under the brake band. This will give less surface area and less friction, reducing the take-up. Now, one thing you may notice that I did on my flyer is I increased the number of hooks on one side of the arm. This allows me to fill in the bobbin without creating hills and valleys. On the other arm of the flyer, I put in the large hooks, and this is the side I use when I'm spinning a large wool yarn. You'll want to move your drive band to the fastest speed that's comfortable. Now, on any wheel, you'll want a fine leader. A 5/2 cotton is an excellent choice. And one easy way to start is to fold a loop, tie a simple knot, and then when you're ready to begin, pull a few fibers through the loop, fold them back on themselves, and begin the spinning. Now, don't start drafting until the twist moves into these fibers. And once they're secured, then you can begin to draft back. That should help some of the beginning starting frustrations that often occurs when spinning cotton. Now, you'll want to sit well back from your wheel. This will give you a long length of yarn that you can test before you pass it in. You want to relax your shoulders and have a very comfortable chair, because when you spin a fine yarn, you often spin many yards of it. A few other hints that may help. If your hands get clammy, baby powder is a good way to dry them. Now, when I spin the fine fibers, I almost always do the singles as a Z, like in wool, and ply at S, unless I'm creating a plied yarn specifically for crochet work. Then I will spin the single as an S and ply at Z. When you crochet, it's better if the last twist on the yarn is a Z. It keeps the yarn from unplying and splitting as you work. First, we'll start with cotton, a very old fiber. Yarns have been dated back to 3000 BC. It grows in a cotton boll, and what we're spinning will be the seed hairs. Now, cotton comes in a variety of colors and forms, and on the table here, I have several of those. It comes naturally in whites, creams, browns, even a green, and they're working on a rusty red. These are ungined cotton. This is the ungined cotton here. Here we have ginned cotton, and the seeds have been removed by machine. Here are punis that have already been carded and rolled into a rowlog. Here is cotton sliver that has been combed into a long type of roving. When you start with a cotton boll, you can break it apart just like an orange and pull off a section. And you'll feel mini seeds. Pull off just one section with a seed in it and begin to fan out the fibers. Many spinners like spinning from ungined cotton because there has been no processing at all of this natural fiber. You'll notice that it is very short, 3/4 of an inch to 1.25 inches. Once you have it fanned out, you can spin directly from the seed. Now make sure you have a fluffy end that you're going to join to. Lay the fluffy fibers on top of the new fibers in your hand and begin spinning. Now don't draft until you see the twist taking on the new fibers. Then you can begin to draft back slowly because you're dealing with a very fine thread and you want a lot of twist. The twist will make a very small drafting triangle as it pulls the fibers off of the seed. Your leading hand is controlling the amount of twist that you allow to run into the fibers. Now it'll be a little hard to pull because the fibers are firmly attached, but people like to spin this way because the cotton is the least processed and the fibers are the longest. And you'll just keep spinning. Stop when you have a bare seed. Plant it next summer if you wish. Now, I prefer to comb the fibers on the seed a little bit. And any of the cards will work. This time I'm using a white, probably an Akela type, because it is very white. And the light brushing or combing really shows off the length of these fibers. White cottons are, at this time, usually longer than your brown cottons. I'll start again. Again, I wait until the twist catches the new fibers. Spinning off of an ungined cotton seed should give you a fairly fine yarn. If it is getting too fine, what you need to do is go back to a place that you feel is thick enough, roll the twist out, and remove the part that's too fine. This gives you a fluffy end to start with. And start in again. And allow a little more twist before you draft back. the seed hairs are fairly firmly attached to the cotton seed. And so my true preference is to take one that's been combed. I'm going to punch out the seed. It's a furry little seed. I've got my donut of fibers. I lay the fluffy end on top. Start the wheel. And when I see the new fibers catching the twist, begin the drafting. As I mentioned before, this should give you a fairly smooth cotton yarn. Now when you feel that you have gotten the size you like, I often make a control yarn. What I do is I fold a length of my yarn on itself and let it ply. I tie a knot in it so that the ply does not escape, the twist doesn't escape. And then I roll the twist toward the wheel with my leading hand so that when I remove it, I have a nice fuzzy end to start spinning on. Now this control yarn gives me a lot of information. It tells me what size I'm spinning, how much twist I'm inserting, and what my particular yarn will look like when it is plied on itself. And I save these for constant reference as I'm spinning later in my bobbin. You can also buy gin cotton. There the seeds have been removed for you. At first, it looks fairly much like a lumpy mess. Sometimes you can buy it carded, but usually you must card it yourself. Wool cards work fine. Charge them, just like you do for wool, fairly lightly. And stroke across. When you remove it, you'll have a soft, textured bat to spin. Now I want to show you how I card cotton, a little bit different technique, on cotton cards. And since cotton dyes so easily with fiber reactive dyes, let's add a little yellow and have fun with it. I'll charge the card. And then instead of stroking all the way across the card, I start at the bottom and work my way up. You can see I'm going up just a little bit each time. And I'm actually taking the teeth into the teeth of the card. What this does is it completely removes all the fiber from the one card and places all of these fibers just on the bottom edge of the second card. Now I'll lay that on my lap and use a nicely sanded dowel rod, about 18 inches long. And with a little finger rubbing here to start it, I'll be able to roll all the fibers off right onto the dowel rod. And if you roll it right here on the back curve, it smooths it out, and then you can push it off. Punis are an easy way to spin cotton. Let me pull these over. Here's some I have created earlier from brown, a solid yellow, a Pima cotton one. Now, when you go to spin, and if you have let your yarn set for a bit, one thing you may need to do, if any of the twist has escaped, you want to start holding firmly near the orifice and be sure you reinsert enough twist to make your yarn stable again. Because if you start pulling out here and the twist has escaped, your yarn will separate and drift apart. A nice fuzzy end. Wait till the fibers start to catch. There they caught. Oh, don't think so. Try it again. Again, a nice fuzzy end. Now, since you have a roll-log type of preparation, a woolen style, where you allow a little bit of twist and then stretch it to the full extent, is easy to use. Let's see. You draft a soft yarn, add more twist, roll down the slubs, check for strength, pass it in. Soft yarn, add more twist, roll down the slubs, pass it in. This should make a nice smooth yarn and will be faster than working with the ungined cotton. Now, you know, sometimes people call me Ms. Spinster because of the column I wrote. And that would be a correct use of the word spinster, which is a female spinner, one who supports themselves by their spinning. The term was brought into use in the colonies in Massachusetts, where households would be assessed a certain number of spinsters. How many women you had that could spin. Women, girls. And from this assessment, you had to produce so many pounds of cotton and wool per week as a tax. Now that you've seen what a nice smooth yarn you can create from your carded cotton, let's see what happens when you use an uncarded cotton. You can spin directly from the lint, just from the handful, simply by teasing it open. This will give you a textured yarn and probably will be a thicker yarn. And to help yourself, change the speed on your spinning wheel. I'm going to move to a slower whirl. This will give me less twist per treadle and more time for my hands as I have to do the drafting on an unprepared fiber. I'll also be spinning a thicker yarn, which means it will need less twist. To start, again lay unspun fibers against the mass And just begin with the twist between your hands, roll down the slubs. Sometimes the twist will jump a large slub like this. Roll it down and continue spinning. You'll get quite a bit of texture. It makes a fun yarn to use as a weft or for knitting or crochet, but it's not a very stable yarn to use as warp. You could use it as a single, or you can ply it on itself. This is what it would look like. Now when you're spinning cotton, you want to spin close to the size yarn that you want to end up with. Cotton does not fold like wool. It will expand a little bit, but very, very little. So spin this yarn the same size that you want to end up with. And don't plan on having it fold like a wool yarn does. And just pull out as much of the slub as you want. Try not to leave very long, wide slubs or very loosely connected slubs. They can be removed. Try not to have really fine gossamer sections in between slubs. They will cause a break. If that happens, slip it off, open up the slub, start in again. Now there's one more form that you can buy cotton in, and this is a cotton sliver. This has been combed and carded for you and comes in it's a very long length. It's a lovely form to look at, very smooth, very lustrous, and also at times the most challenging to spin. I usually start with a length, and to keep my hands from dampening it, I wrap it around my wrist so that all I hold is just the end where I'm spinning from. This part is just storage. Now I released my yarn, so when I start I'm going to build the twist back up, make sure there's sufficient twist there, and lay the unspun on top of the fibers. And begin spinning. You can use a woolen where you draft fast and then even down the twist and check for strength. Or you can use a worsted method where the twist stays under your lead hand. You see I roll the twist back with my thumb and then slide the twist down. Now, one thing I want to mention before we go on is that when you look at a sliver, you should always check and see how long the fibers are. Do this just by simply pulling out a few fibers at a time from the end. And you can see that they're just about, 1.25 inches long. This is a good pima. Some of them will be only 3/4 of an inch long. And when you go back to spin, if your yarn does like mine and catches on the orifice where the oil is, remove that part. Start with a fluffy end and begin spinning. I usually use a worsted for the top. That way I get a tight twist by keeping the twist behind my fingers. and I roll it back and in. I'm rolling the twist toward the wheel and then into the fibers. Work your way across the tip of the sliver, making sure that you catch each set of ends in turn. And when you've used up a portion, open this hand and move it back. Don't slide your hand down the sliver. If you do that, you tend to ruffle and drag the fibers backwards and make a mess of this nicely prepared fiber. So I always tell my classes, no petting. It's just like petting a little kitty cat. Don't rub back. Now that we've finished spinning our singles, we'll do some plying. I have already changed to an empty bobbin on the wheel. I'm going to switch back to a higher speed. And check the take-up. It should be a little stronger. Okay. Now, plying cotton is quite like plying wool. You can ply from two bobbins, and if you're afraid of them snarling on each other as they come off the bobbin, use two different lazy cates and place one cate on the left and one lazy cate on the right. Or you can ply from a single ball of yarn, spinning from the inside end and the outside end. If you do that, tie the two ends together while it's on the ball winder. Then lift the ball off and slide your fingers in the hand that usually holds the fibers. Put the knotted end through the leader. Again, fold it back on itself. And begin the plying process. Pull out a length. Let the twist run in. Pull out another length. Here I'm using a ball that has brown and white cotton spun alternately. Give a variegated yarn. Always tension the two strands before you allow the twist to come in. So as it unwinds, tension it, allow the twist to run in. Unwind it, tension, allow the twist to run in. Check periodically if you're getting enough ply to make a pleasant yarn. You can compare it back to your control yarn that you started at the beginning. If it happens that a ply breaks, like here, tie the broken ply back together and leave an extra long length so that when you use this yarn in your project, you'll be able to remove that knotted section because you know it's weaker and not as nicely prepared. And then go back to plying again. Now, once you have done your plying, or you've chosen to use your yarn as singles, you need to finish by washing it. I have a small skein here of singles that I've taken off the niddy-noddy. I've tied it well in at least 4 places. Here, 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 and here. A small skein like this doesn't need a figure-8 tie at these spots, but if it was a larger skein, I would use figure-8s. Now, when the skein goes into the water, the fibers relax and begin to untwist, and they can drift apart. To prevent that from happening, I make a twisted skein of yarn to wash it, and I twist it in the direction of the last twist. Here it was a Z. Fold it on itself. Straighten it out. You have a nice little twisted skein that you can wash in hot soapy water with a little detergent. You can squeeze it, you can rinse it, you can wring it out. You can handle it quite well and really feel that it's well washed. And the water will go through it, but the yarns are trapped and they can't untwist on you as they might if the skein was loose. Now, if you simmer the yarn for 30 to 40 minutes, you'll deepen the color. Here you can see the difference between natural green as fiber and the green skein that became a deeper color from being simmered in a detergent water. Your Pima cotton and your brown cottons likewise get darker if you simmer them for 30 to 40 minutes instead of just sink wash them. It doesn't matter which method you choose to wash your cotton, hand wash or simmer. When you take it out of the water, you'll need to open it up, and you want to snap it open with your hands inside. Rotate the skein around, snap, rotate, snap, and then hang it to dry. If you need a little weight, maybe a hand towel hung across the bottom is sufficient. If it's plied, you shouldn't need any weight on it. Let's review by looking at some of the yarns that I have spun. Here I have a textured yarn spun from lint, a heavy yarn spun from Pima. You can see the difference in the color, the creamy Pima color and the white Akela. A very fine yarn spun from punis, a fine yarn spun from Pima, applied, a medium, and a multicolored yarn using various natural colors. Your yarns can be used for many projects: a small crocheted purse, a fun necklace and swingy earrings, or you can do a weaving project like the vest I've been wearing, all hand-spun yarns, warp and weft, all out of cotton. Now I'd like to move to a whole different subject. Let's spin silk. When you first look at silk, you notice the difference in colors. There's the whites that are all from the Bombyx mori silkworms. These are the cultivated silkworms that are only allowed to eat mulberry leaves, and their fiber stays white. On this side, we have various tans, honey color, a golden cinnamon color. All of these fibers come from the group of silkworms we call tussa silkworms, or wild silkworms. They're allowed to eat whatever they choose, and the tannin that's found in the leaves that they eat permanently darkens the fibers, so the golden color is a permanent color. Now, when you look at these under a microscope, you would see a vast difference in size. The Bombyx mori, the white, is very fine, 10 to 13 microns. The tussa is almost twice the size, 27 to 30 microns. Before we start spinning silk, I'd like you to learn a little more about the silkworm and the cocoon that it creates, and the way to reel silk straight from a cocoon. The silkworm eggs are stored in the refrigerator during the fall and winter, and then taken out in the spring just before the mulberry leaves appear on the trees. The eggs usually hatch in 10 to 14 days at room temperature. The larvae immediately begin to feed on fresh, clean leaves. They will eat day and night for about 4 weeks, increasing in size 10,000 times. During this time, they will molt 5 times, shedding their skin so that the soft new skin will stretch as they grow. Before and after shedding skin, they rest in a trance for about 24 hours. At the end of the 4 weeks of feeding, they begin to look for a place to spin their cocoon. They've lost interest in food. To spin, they like corners, paper egg cartons, crumpled paper towels, etc. They spin a continuous filament of silk for 3 days and nights. Then inside the cocoon, the larva now becomes a pupa or chrysalis. In about 3 weeks, it emerges as a moth. Male and female moths mate. The female lays eggs and the moths die in 4 to 5 days.
Hello, I'm Nancy Simpson, and I'm going to show you how I reel silk. First, I go to my supply of cocoons and pick out the best shaped, the healthiest, strongest looking cocoons. About 30 of them I like to do at one time. And then I peel off the excess silk that is on the outside, and I put that to the waste. Clean it all off. This is where the silkworm started to spin his cocoon. Then I take, like I said, about 30 of them, have them prepared to go into the hot water. Just a pan of plain hot water. And when they simmer for about 20 minutes, the Saracen softens. And that enables me to pull off more of the outer coating and find the single end, which that isn't going to be. Sometimes I have to use a toothbrush. There we have a single coming down. And I do this for all 30 cocoons. It comes off the silk cocoon just the way the silkworm laid it down. And then I take it and put it in my hot water. And I gather all 30 of them together. And I take them over this wet cotton ball up here. And I take them, that brings them all together. And I take them through the hook eye. And the distance between the pot, the water, and the reel at the far end of the table, the silk will dry, and the Saracen, that is the glue-like substance that makes them hard, will dry, and it will glue back together all the 30 filaments and make one thread. So by the time it reaches the reel, it's dry. Now I have the reel in a barbecue rotisserie motor, and I operate it with my foot. The final result of the reeling is a thread like this.
I have loosely divided all the silk forms into 3 large overlapping groups. On this whole side we have a variety of cocoon forms. Here I have carded rovings, and you'll notice that they're not as shiny as this section here, which are the combed slivers, and the comb brings out your shiniest silk. Now, one hint before we start, if your hands are at all rough and the fibers stick to you like that, use a good hand cream before you start. Now, you saw reeling from the hard cocoon. You can't spin a hard cocoon, but you can spin from a degummed cocoon, one that has been pierced open and the sericin washed out. To start spinning, you'll be on a fairly fast speed. You might increase your take-up just a little bit because these fibers are longer than the cotton fibers. Find the loop, pull a few fibers through, fold them on themselves, and begin to spin. As you hold the cocoon lightly, the fibers just slide off. The drafting triangle can be fairly wide and large because you're dealing with much longer fibers. To make a thicker yarn, draft back slower. To make a thinner yarn, draft back faster. As you draft, you may want to roll down slubs, but you can allow the twist just to run between your hands, and the fibers just continue to pull off. This is usually the easiest way to spin silk, and it's a fairly inexpensive form of silk also. The yarn you get will be textured lightly and very, very strong. Since the fibers are so long, twist is not a critical part of this spinning. Now, when you get to the point where short little papery fibers come off, these are called the bassinet. These are the last fibers spun by the silkworm. This is where I stop, remove the end of that cocoon. Those fibers can be saved and carted into wool or other fibers as an added texture. But I begin with a new cocoon, and this time they're fighting me. Let's do a dyed one for fun. These were dyed with fiber reactive dyes. Allow a very generous overlap when you join on here. Watch the twist run in, and again, let the fibers slide off the cocoon. Roll down the slubs. There's a temptation to allow silk into the wheel with very little twist because it is such a strong fiber. The lack of twist will not impair the strength of the yarn, but it does decrease the luster. Look at how dull this is. And then I'm going to hold it out here and add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more treadles. And I'll get a harder twist on it. You'll get more shine and a less fuzzy yarn. The extra twist is not for strength, but it increases the shine and it reduces the fuzziness of the yarn. And it's your choice as spinner how much twist you want to put on it. Roll down the slubs. Now, spinning from a cocoon should give you a softly textured silk yarn. The next cocoon form that I want to talk about is the carded roving. It comes in a large open bat. And if you look at it, you can see cocoon shapes all through it. They just ran the cocoons through a large drum carder. If you check for fiber lengths, which is a good idea anytime you're spinning, you'll find some are very, very long, longer than my arms, and some are quite short. To deal with this, you're going to want to strip the bat down, and just break the last fibers apart. And even do some pre-drafting. That will give you a feeling of how far apart you need to have your hands. This fiber is a big jump from the cotton, where we dealt with very short 3/4 to 1 1/4 inch length fibers. Now we're dealing with fibers that, if you look at one fiber from the cocoon, can be up to 1 mile long. And so in this carded bat, we'll have fibers of greatly varying lengths. If you pre-draft, you'll notice that you need to keep your hands quite far apart and that the fibers are very, very strong. And so that pulling is quite a bit of work. I prefer to pre-draft when I deal with this type of preparation, so that while I'm spinning, I have less work to do. Okay, back to the beginning of it. Now, I'll give you a quiz. Will this spin a smooth yarn? Absolutely not. We'll choose this form when we want a very highly textured yarn. And it probably will be a little thicker yarn also. Overlap, fuzzy, over brand new, draft back, roll down the slubs. Keep your hands quite far apart. And at the beginning of your bobbin, do a check and see if you're putting in enough twist. Because in this form, just like the cocoon, the amount of twist determines the amount of shine, not the strength. The strength is already there because you're dealing with such long fibers. That looks good to me. Don't try to make a smooth and even yarn from this fiber. That's like fighting yourself. You bought this preparation because you wanted a textured yarn. Now I have some that I have dyed, and I'll show you how that spins up. For the dyeing, I pulled off the roving, I stripped off a length, and then I braided it. And now I need to pre-draft. The dyeing will make the fibers a bit more tacky. And if they're hard to draft, open them here with your fiber hand. It's an action kind of like snapping your fingers. And that will make it easier to pre-draft. I'll start with that much. If you have a fear of spiders, this may come out to you because when you work with these cocoon forms, the fibers begin to float all around you, and you have that feeling almost of walking into a spider web. And at first it can be a little bit disconcerting. Again, draft back, roll down the twist, and aim for a nicely textured yarn. This can be plied on itself or plied against a smooth yarn for a nice effect. Next, I want to move into the bell form. Secure this. A silk bell, see me fighting my fibers, is the cocoon form. It has been degummed and then opened up in water and stretched over a bell shape so that you have a true large bell shape. It's one of the nicest forms of silk. It also can be quite challenging to work with, but there's things that will help. First, one hand inside and one hand on the outside, and you wish to pinch a small amount, just a little bit, with the outside hand, and with the inside hand grab the rest tightly. And then we're going to separate one layer off, because this bell is made from maybe 30 cocoons. And you keep stretching, stretching, and you have one layer of the bell here and all the rest here. Break it apart, lay that aside. Now, there are two ways to spin a bell. My favorite is to break this open so that I have a large donut. And here you can really begin to see how long these fibers are. And again, pre-draft. If it's hard to pull, use that finger snapping action and spread these fibers, widen that triangle, that drafting triangle. Because this is a very strong fiber. In fact, if steel is spun to the, extruded to the size of silk, silk is much stronger and can hold a greater weight. We'll end up with a long, long roving from one layer of the cap. And you can break it apart somewhere. And like the cotton, loosely wrap it on your wrist or drop it at your feet if you don't have cats or small kids. All right. To join, you're going to make a long overlap, let the fibers catch in, and then continue the drafting, and you'll have a large drafting triangle. Roll down the twist. Again, you're going for a textured yarn because you've got many different lengths of fibers mixed up in this preparation. Pull off another wrap. This will make a smoother textured yarn than the carded that I looked at a moment ago. But you'll still get quite a bit of texture. This is a very, very strong yarn. And if you put a lot of twist in, a very, very shiny yarn. Now they say silk was discovered in the emperor's garden by his daughter. She'd gone out to drink a cup of tea and sat under a mulberry tree. And suddenly a cocoon fell right into her teacup. Now she was very distressed to see this thing laying in her tea, and so she took her chopsticks and tried to fish it out. And not wanting to really pick it up, she began to pull around it and lifted just a fine strand, and realized as she pulled the fiber off that it could be used for a fabric. Now let me stop here and I'll show you another method of dealing with a bell. And I'll pull another bell off. Okay, here's the bell. I'm going to reach in, pull off some fibers, pinch the inside quite tightly, and then go between them and break the fibers in two. Now it is possible, I said I like to pre-draft, but a number of people don't pre-draft, they just begin to spin from the tip. If you choose to do this, you will be working with your hands very far apart, and you'll be doing more work during the actual spinning. But I'm just taking fibers straight from the tip and working with an enormous drafting triangle. Rolling the twist down. The next form of silk I want to talk about are the carded rovings. You can buy them from the Bombex Mori, the white, or the various tussas, or you can dye them. Let's start with the cinnamon tussa. This is a very dark cinnamon, and anytime you work with a roving, the first thing you should do is always pull off a few fibers and find out what length went into this particular roving. These fibers came from cocoons that were cut and carded, and you can see the fiber lengths vary from about 4 to about 6 inches. That will give us information about how far apart our hands need to work. Now, the next thing you ought to do with a new roving is try a little pre-drafting. See what the feel of the fibers are. And it feels a little tacky compared to a wool roving. And it's kind of an odd tackiness because it holds and then it gives. And it holds together and then it gives. It probably will work better, start at the other end, if you do a little stripping and narrow it down to a narrower roving. Now try drafting it, and it feels more comfortable. Now once again, when we start spinning, I'm going to encourage you to, as you spin, move your hand and don't pet. I have always said you can strip, but you can't pet in my spinning classes. I'll wrap it around my wrist. And attach onto the end of the bell. Again, loose fiber to loose fiber. Now, a cut and carded roving will still make a textured yarn. Because the fibers are not as long as we had in the bell or the cocoon, we need more twist for stability. The actual give it strength this time. And as you get started, you'll want to check and see, make a control yarn, how you like what you're coming up with. This is a nice yarn. Again, tie a knot. Pull this end off, go back, roll the twist out. If you cut it, you'll have a cut end, which is very hard to join onto. So you always want to roll the twist out when you remove your control yarn. And you've got a nice fuzzy end to join onto. I usually spin this, what would be called a worsted. I keep the twist under my thumb and finger, and then let the twist follow my hand down after I have drafted. Then if there's any thicker slubs, I can thin them down, roll the slubs down. And now, let me talk a bit about the control yarn. As you're spinning, and you've gone halfway through your bobbin, what you do is you fold the length back on itself and do a visual comparison to your original control yarn. This will tell you if you're staying about the same size and the same amount of twist. If it looks good, then continue what you're doing. If you have reduced the size, and here it looks like I have, then you know not to draft so fast, but to slow down the drafting and build the size up just a little bit. This control yarn can be used a week from now, a year from now, to check and repeat this particular yarn. Now when you're spinning silk, you don't need to allow any room for fulling because silk will not full when you wash it or steam it as a finishing. In fact, if anything, the silk will become smaller, especially if you have made a soft yarn. Don't pet. Open the back hand and move it down the fibers. It'll spin quite like wool, but it's a little bit more tacky. Now there'll be very little difference between spinning the tussa and the bombex. The dyed ones will be a little tackier because being in the dye bath, you can see how they've compacted on each other, and so you might want to snap them apart a little to get a little compacted from the dye bath and do some pre-drafting. To get this lovely speckled effect, I braided the roving before it went into the dye pot. I didn't show you how long the fibers were. Let's check those out. These are shorter than the tussa were. It may be different every time you buy a new batch of silk. So this tells me my hands will work a little closer together than I did with the tussa. Okay. The last form of silk, the one that brings to mind the name silk, is the combed forms. Now you can buy it as a brick, usually Bombex, the white, or you can buy comb top. There's a great variety in the tops. You can see here there's 3 different widths: a very narrow top, medium, and fairly wide. You can also see a little difference in color. And when you buy any prepared fibers, you have to consider each order as a dye lot, even though these are a natural color. But the next batch may be a little different color, so order enough to do the complete job. Now, let's look at the brick. This is a very hard, compact form of silk. And when you buy it, you have to buy the full 5 1/3 ounces. It's a lot of silk in here. It's been folded tightly and compacted together and feels hard like a brick, not at all soft. But when you go to break it open, you'll see how much fiber is actually in here. It's just an enormous amount of fiber, though it's a very small package. It's all tightly folded on itself. It's often very hard to spin because look how wide this roving is. It's a very, very wide roving. In fact, this is the first form, and the narrow rovings come after the brick. Come back to the beginning, and you'll probably want to break off a small amount. And again, we're going to need to strip it down, a fairly narrow bunch. And you want to do this carefully so you don't mess up the nice alignment. We're going to smooth the fibers back before you begin to spin. Now, the new roving, how long are the fibers? Well, these are quite short. These are between 2 and 3 inches long. They're very, very shiny, but they're also have been cut quite short. And so that tells me how close my hands are going to have to be, much closer than for either of the rovings. Now, do a little bit of pre-drafting, and you'll feel that the fiber is quite slick. It doesn't have the tackiness that the noil rovings have, that the carded rovings have. You can put it on your wrist. And begin to spin. This is not the easiest form to spin. It's probably one of the most challenging forms because it is so very slick. You'll want to spin it quite fine because it is shorter fibers. And if you keep the twist under your leading hand and use a rolling motion where you roll the twist toward the wheel and then into the fibers. Roll the twist back and roll it in. back and in. It's a very short kind of approach to spinning. But look at the yarn you're getting. Let's fold some and see what we're getting here. Okay. For comparison, let me put more twist in and see which one we like better. Lay that there. So to get more twist, I'm going to slow down my hands and speed up my feet. And here it really helps to roll the twist back toward the wheel. It's a very small motion. It's only like half a turn under my thumb. Roll the twist back. Let's look at the combed rovings in the tussa. Remember I said we have a really wide one and a medium one and a fairly short one. Let's take or narrow one. Let's check the length. Oh, we've got longer fibers here. This means there's one more technique we can try, and that is spinning over your finger, because these fibers are 4 to 6 inches long. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull one length off, lay them there on my leg, and another length. I'll make another little set of fibers. You may have spun over your finger with wool, using one lock at a time. It works well for silk and any fibers that you're having a little drafting trouble, a little control trouble. Spin it over your fingers. Excuse me, I've got silk on my face. Okay, take this nice little length. You're going to put it between your first two fingers, and you're going to lay the ends down into your hand. You can circle them with the lower fingers. Some people like to put them between the lower fingers. It's just a matter of technique. But we're going to draft from the middle here, right from the tip, from the fold. Clean off my leg and you can see better. To start out, lay the last spun fibers from the tip all the way under your thumb. And then watch till you feel the twist catch the new fibers. And now the drafting triangle is being made over your fingertip. And the fibers feed off from both sides. Gives you a nice sized drafting triangle. If you're going thinner than you want, slow down your hands. If it's too thick, then you need to speed up your hands. But you'll be able to spin all the fibers right off your fingertip. Now the fingertip has to always point right at the yarn. And you can allow the twist to run ahead right up against it. And in this case, your leading hand is acting more like, for a woolen yarn, just releasing the twist every now and then and pulling against to check the strength. This is also a good technique if you have trouble petting your yarns and you have a bad habit. Spin over your finger for a while, because you can't pet when you've got them wrapped around your hand like this. You just have to go ahead and spin them all off. After you have plied your yarn or decide to use it as a single, you want to wind it off into a skein on a knitting knotty and tie it in at least 4 places. If it's a larger skein, use more ties, and if it's a finer yarn, use more ties. Because the critical problem in washing the silk is not to get it tangled up on itself. Now you have a choice. You can wash it or steam it. Steaming will give you a rounder yarn, and you would do this over a large open kettle or over your ironing board with a steam iron. If you're going to wash it, I recommend again that you wind it into a skein like we did for cotton, this time to prevent it from being tangled on itself in the washing process. And wind it up, let it twist back. And it only takes a very light washing because it's a very clean fiber. It's already been degummed. Just a little bit of washing and rinsing. You can use vinegar in the rinse and then roll it in a towel to squeeze out the excess water. And then you want to open it back up and snap the skein open. Since you washed it as a twisted skein, it shouldn't be tangled. And you can lightly snap it open and then hang it to dry. Now, as it is drying, it may become stiff. And what you can do to help that, if your skein is stiffening up, that means there's a little bit of sarrasin left in it. Take the skein and twist it fairly hard in both directions. This is called lustering. And you're going to twist and twist and twist and twist and stretch. Then you're going to let go and go into the opposite direction. And what this does is this breaks a little minute bond that the sarrasin has formed between the strands of fiber. And again, you're going to twist it up, stretch, and then let it go back to drying and finish drying. You can do this a couple times in the drying process. You can do it after it's completely dry. Now, I want to review with a few of the yarns that I have here and encourage you to try the different styles of spinning and the different forms, because they make many different yarns. Here we have some nice medium-sized plied yarns with a nice high luster. I have some fine singles spun from, this is a bleached tussa. It has a very lovely ivory color. Here's a fine singles spun from the bombex. This is a very fine 1,100 yards to the ounce single spun from a bombex noil. It's got a little tiny flake all through it. Spun very fine with a lot of twist. Here's a very heavy yarn spun from 2 kinds of tussa. If you see the little difference in shine, one ply is combed and one ply is carded. So one ply is a little shinier than the other. Gives it a little different look as it bends in the light. Here's our plied yarn from the cinnamon tussa. This lovely blue is from a dyed bell, plied on itself. Here's a bell that was just spun with lots of texture, thick and thin, matte and shiny, and used in this small collar, crocheted collar. Here's a yarn spun with lots of texture, very thick and very thin, plied against a tussa, and used in the weaving of this tie. Here's a necklace of a singles tussa that was dyed, little crocheted earrings. Here's a scarf. This is the most fun. I wish you could feel it, because it has this lovely hang and drape and swing to the fringe. It's bombex spun very thick and thin, lots of texture, plied against a thread, and then woven against a singles tussa yarn, spun smooth and even. And here, the last little set are the many different yarns that I used in my vest. And now we're ready to put away our silk and go to a whole nother fiber, the fascinating world of flax. Next, we're going to talk about flax fibers and linen yarns. Now, these bast fibers are very old. Samples have been dated back to 5000 BC. The fibers are found in these long stems of the flax plant. There's a really long process that the plant goes through before you can get the flax fibers out. This bundle has already been dried and retted or rotted and dried again, and now I can break the fibers, the stems, and knock some of the outer chaff off and show you the fibers inside. This isn't done by hand, it's done with a number of very large pieces of equipment. And if you grew flax, you could process it yourself if you had all the equipment. Fortunately, as hand spinners, we can buy the flax already processed, the fibers already stripped out in the stores, and begin with flax in a processed form. I'll show on the table here the forms that you can buy. First, I have flax roving or top. It has been combed and carded, just like you're used to with wool. You can buy it as a natural color, and you can buy it bleached. Sometimes you'll see it, and they've run it through a machine crimping process to give it a little bending, softening of the fibers. Often you can buy it dyed. The other form that you can buy is the long line or the strict, the old-fashioned form. This has been hackled and dressed, and it's a very long, twisted, kind of a hank of just fibers. And here we have the toe fibers, which are the short tangled fibers that are combed out in the process of using the line. Now we'll start spinning on the cut and carded roving because that's the most familiar and the most like wool. Before we start spinning the flax roving or the flax top, let's adjust the wheel. This is a wiry fiber and it'll feel more comfortable with a bit more take-up. So you adjust the take-up on your wheel so it pulls in a little harder for you. And I'm going to be spinning in the S direction for my singles because my favorite thing to do with flax is crochet. And I'll apply this and that will give me a final twist of a Z, as I mentioned earlier, that when I crochet I like a Z twist yarn. Now look at your roving. And as I've said before, the first thing to do with a new roving is pull out a few fibers and see what length you're dealing with. Here we can see this roving is about 4 to 6 inches. And that helps me know how far apart my hands will be working. Since I have some pink, I think I'll work with that today. Let's check the length here. It's maybe even a little longer. Looks like many of them, it goes between 4 and 8 inches. So I'll be dealing with a larger variety of lengths in this roving. Okay. Flax does not have a natural crimp like you're used to with wool. And joining can be one of the hardest parts. The fibers tend to slide off. So come to a little bit of a thick spot, remove the twist from your last spun yarn, if you're joining to a yarn already spun, Open it out, make it a little hairy, and lay a fairly long length across the new fibers. Begin the wheel twisting, and again, don't draft until you see new fibers caught in the twist. Then you can begin to draft back. Keeping the twist under your leading hand, like you would for a worsted wool yarn, will help keep the twist out of the fibers and the roving. Now when that begins to feel comfortable and you feel that the wheel is set about right, then you want to add some water, because flax that is spun into a linen yarn, dry, makes a hairy yarn that looks more like burlap than the fine linen we're used to. And if it's wet spun, that helps smooth down these little ends and gives a smoother, finer yarn. So I have my little water pot. I've tied a length of yarn around it, and that will allow me to hang it on one of my knobs. I already have a towel over my lap, and if you have good carpet, you probably put a towel under your wheel in your chair. And now, as you're spinning, your lead hand has an extra job. You're going to begin the draft, reach in, wet your fingers, and smooth the fibers down with wet fingers. And when your fingers begin to get dry, reach over, come back to where you left off, smooth more. Now I'm just going to work my way across the end of this top, catching in a fiber or two from this side, then working over to here, catching a fiber. Again, no petting allowed. Release this hand and move it back, the fiber hand. And just pick a few more fibers each time. And keep your fingertips wet. You'll develop a rhythm, maybe about 4 treadles. And wet your fingers. Now you'll want to be sure that this part, the roving, does not get wet. Some people store it in a plastic bag. If it's long enough, you can wrap it around your wrist. Because the water acts a bit like a glue when the flax is at this point of processing, and it glues these ends down. And if the roving gets wet, then you won't be able to draft the new fibers out smoothly. I will include this bunch. Flax is always best spun fine, smooth, and even. If you want a thicker yarn, ply 2, 3, 4 plies together, and you'll be happy with your yarn. If you spin a thick singles, you're liable to feel it looks like burlap and be upset with your end result. Now, my favorite form of flax is a long line strick spun on a distaff. There are many kinds of distaffs that have been used over the years and can be bought, but a very simple one can be made with just a few tools at home. You need some kind of stand. I use a dress form stand. A music stand also works. A simple long dowel, which I glued a few beads to, and we can make a distaff. Now there's many ways to dress one, and what I'll teach you today is the easiest and quickest, but there are many other methods you may want to learn. Now when you look at the strick, I have here 2 stricks from 2 different sources, and I want to point out that buying a fiber is like buying a dye batch. I cannot make the yarn that comes from this batch will not match the yarn that comes from this batch. So when you buy your fibers, buy enough to complete your project or plan on doing an overdye to make the fibers match, the yarns match. Okay, this is the strict. It's a big hank of fibers twisted together. When you open it out, you can see that you have the full length of fiber that went from the root all the way up to the stalk end. And as you look, you'll notice that one end is coarser and one end is finer. Now the first thing I'm going to do is pull out a fingerful. Right, starting in the middle. So I'll separate out a section and pull it all the way out. Now before I deal with that, because I have cats and kids, I'm going to put the rest of my strick away for safekeeping and just twist the ends together. Now, take the softest end of your fingerful, and if you have wool combs, you can use those to open it out, and if you don't, you can use something like a dog comb with wide-spaced teeth. And first you just want to kind of shake it to loosen the fibers, but hold it in the middle and begin to comb from the end. If you have a daughter with long hair that's tangled, you'll think of her as you work your way up. Start at the bottom, work your way up, and comb through. What we're doing is pulling out the tangles that have come from storage and transportation. And what we have on our comb will be used later as tow. We'll put that in our little tow pile. Comb up to about halfway. Now you can comb too much, so you have to know when to stop, when it looks fairly open. Because if you keep on combing, you'll get out great long lengths, and then you've combed too far. Now at this end, what we're going to do, we're going to come down 5 or 6 inches, and we're going to take a ribbon. It should match your eyes. So if you have blue eyes, you use a blue ribbon. And we're going to tie it tightly in the middle of the ribbon, around the top of this strick, this hank of flax fibers. Very tight, snug tie. And then we're going to tie it around the top of our pole. Again, very tight and snug. And I use a hair binder to hold the pole to the dress form. A dowel fits very neatly into a music stand, if you have one of those at your house, have any musically inclined kids or husband. And you're going to take the ends, keeping the tail out of the way, and crisscross the ribbon back and forth around our little ponytail hank here. And tie it loosely. All we're doing is keeping the fibers from getting tangled. Here's a little chunk of something. All right, and we've got these loose fibers hanging here at the bottom. Now, joining onto a distaff, we're dealing with very long fibers. So I'm going to pull out a fairly long length from my wheel, and I'm going to pick up, and you may not be able to see this, just a few fibers, just 2 or 3. And I have a very long lead here coming out the back, okay? I'm going to wet and just hand roll those new fibers against the yarn and begin spinning. Now the distaff is like your third hand, and it's going to be the fiber hand for you. So you want to place it on the side where you usually hold your fibers, and a little bit to the side and maybe even back. In fact, if I was at home, I would probably put it a little further back than I have it here. But I'm using it here, hopefully so that you can see what's happening a little better. I'm going to dip my hands in and pull the fibers out. Now your lead hand has just the same job it had when we spun the top. Control the twist and dampen the fibers and smooth it down. The back hand has a new job. It is controlling how many fibers come in, and if a snarl like this appears, where fibers have crisscrossed on each other, the back hand can choose to just take those out, lay the new ones back on, and the back hand just kind of keeps the majority of the fibers pulling away from the twist and out of the twist, but I'm not going to push fibers up onto the distaff. I'm just going to keep them separate, or keep them out of the twist as it's coming up under my thumb. Now, since you're dealing with such long, wiry fibers at this point, you know, I like to have a pretty good take-up pull from my wheel, but you must be careful that you're not passing the yarn in too quickly without enough twist. Now, even when you fold it back on itself, you'll realize that you have to twist it in the opposite direction because it is so wiry it won't even do that for you. But ply it up the way you would like the yarn to be, and see if there's enough twist in the original singles so that you still see individual plies. In other words, if when you ply it back, fold it on itself, it looks like a singles yarn, then you don't have enough twist in the singles. If you have the look of a plied yarn, then you're getting about the right amount of twist. So you may want to adjust your flyer speed. And as you get better at this, you can go at a really high speed. Now my flax has been behaving today, and one of the things I wanted to show you that does happen and will happen to you sometime is what happens if you've gotten too fine and all of a sudden it's gotten away from you. Now since you have been wetting it down, it's often very hard to find the end on the bobbin. If you keep a toothbrush nearby, you often can brush it up. You need to notice which way your bobbin is wound on, and pretty soon, here we've caught it. Whoops. You'll be able to brush up the end of your yarn. Now, since this has very little twist, I'll show you how to join on again. I'm going to unwind a long length Come back to the fine hooks. Pull it through the orifice. And since it is damp, I can go ahead and kind of line it up against the distaff here. Like I started before, take just about 2 fibers, wet them down, roll them in. As I begin to add them on. Now as you work up your strict, you can just lower the fibers so that you always have the drafting going on in a very comfortable position so that you can see what's happening and you're sitting back and relaxing. When I first started flax, I did not like it, but it's now one of my favorite fibers to spin. But it was so different than cotton, silk, or wool. And it's wiry, and it needs a little help going into the wheel sometimes. So that's why I like to increase the take-up. And you would just continue, and you'll be able to spin almost the whole amount that's here on your distaff, just working your way up. Move the ribbon up as you go, and go through the fibers. What do we do with these tangled fibers, the toe? Of course, they're not going to spin a smooth and even yarn, but take them, cut them into a little shorter bit because there's likely a few long ones in here, and card them on your hand cards. Pull it on, much like you do for wool. And then do a simple carding. You'll have multiple lengths, though, so rolling them up like a roll log will be the perfect way to deal with all those variety of lengths. Doff it off. And this time just roll it up by hand. And you have a roll log. This will make a very soft, textured linen yarn. If you bind it or apply it against a smooth one that you spun off of the distaff, it makes quite an interesting novelty yarn. Again, to join on, I pulled it through the loop. And then just draft back. It'll feel the most like wool of any of the fibers we've worked with. I still, though I've rolled it like a roll log, I still use more of a worsted control of the twist under my thumb and finger because I still like to make it as smooth as a yarn as possible. Don't worry about little lumps and slubs, just roll them down. Spinning the toe should feel very comfortable and very easy. Now before we leave the subject of spinning flax and linen yarns, I want to talk a little bit about plying. It's not hard to ply linen, but there's a few things that will help avoid frustration. To make the smoothest yarn, you'll want to spin from the beginning end. So if you go from your bobbin, you'll be spinning from the last spun, and you're going against the nap of these wiry fibers. You'll have a nicer yarn if you wind the bobbin off onto a core. Toilet paper rolls fit on most ball winders. Now don't remove the yarn from the core. Just leave it on the core, half on each, and use 2 different containers. And place one on each side of you. Attach like you would for any other plying. Adding water to the twist as it runs in will make it even smoother and an even nicer yarn. But remember to leave it on a core because these wiry yarns will tangle on themselves and cause more knots than you'll want to deal with. I want to close and show you some of my yarns and projects that I've done with linen. Scoured linen is a lovely silver color. Now to get it there, I always fold it into a folded skein like I did with cotton and silk, but because it's a wiry fiber, I tie the loops together loosely with a little cotton yarn. And then to scour it, you will actually simmer it in a pot of water using detergent and a washing soda, about 2 teaspoons of washing soda per ounce of linen yarn. You may need to scour it twice. You'll be amazed at how dirty the water comes out. Now, you rinse well. Do not use a vinegar because this is a cellulose fiber and acids will damage it, and hang it to dry. After it's dry, if it feels stiff, you can work it in your hands to soften it up. And another traditional method is to hammer it. Use a wooden board and a wooden hammer and just have at it. Turn it over. This increases the luster and softens the yarn as it's being used for use. Now, when you are finished with your yarn, there are many things you can do with a linen yarn. And I have several skeins here and projects I'll mention to you. Here are some yarns I'd like to encourage you to try and spin. Some singles from line or from toe. Maybe a nice plied bleached flax. Comes out very shiny, or a plied line. And if you want to do a heavy one, use a multiple ply. This has 6 plies spun together. Here is a textured yarn using Ramie for 1 ply and a fine 2-ply linen for the other. It was used in weaving this little mat. Here are the 3 yarns that were used in this long linen table runner. Now when you're beginning on fine fibers, sometimes you need to make some little projects before you have spun for hours and hours. Earrings crocheted are a wonderful project. A doily is another fun thing because a doily doesn't have to fit anything. You just keep going around and you stop when you're out of yarn. It's a fun way to practice some crochet stitches and use your yarn. Now make a few words about all the yarns. When you're weaving with the yarns we've talked about, they do not full, and so you want to set your fibers, your yarns closer together in your reed. When you're doing crochet work, as I mentioned many times, a Z twist for the last twist on the yarn, whether it's single or plied, will give you a better crochet project. Now when you're knitting with these yarns, you must remember that none of the yarns, cotton, silk, nor linen, are inherently stretchy like wool. So choose stitches that will put the stretch into the finished product instead of depending on the yarn to put the stretch into the finished product. Your stitches can do that, and use a smaller needle than you perhaps would with wool because you need to pack things closer together. And I'd like to finish by pointing out my crocheted collar. It's from 2-ply line, spun fairly fine and even, and it makes an easy addition to your wardrobe. Now, I hope I have shown you several different techniques that you can use in this beginning course on spinning cotton, silk, and flax fibers. Go back, look at each section, the one you wish to start with, and give it a try. Try a skein of each type and decide for yourself which kind you like. And keep notes of what worked for you, which techniques, because in the end, if you enjoy spinning a fiber a certain way and it works for the project you have chosen, then your technique is correct. There are many, many ways to spin. It's been done for centuries. There isn't a wrong way. Be brave, go out there and spin. And once you're comfortable with cotton, silk, and flax, you can tackle many other fibers. Angora or cashmere spin a lot like cotton. They're very short. I want to encourage you to have fun with it, and soon you'll be spinning yarns for your own heirloom treasures.